Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening for those on the other side of the pond. My name is Kubin, and I'm really excited to moderate this panel about reciprocity, equity, and inclusion. We're going to cover a range of topics with a great group of panelists, including Sutton King from Journey Colab, Andrew DeAngelo, who's been very involved in the cannabis industry and the Last Prisoner Project, Jason Ortiz from the Students for Sensible Drug Policy, and Serena Wu from Plant Medicine Law Group. So before getting into it, I would love to do a quick round of introductions. Let's go around the horn. Sutton, please introduce yourself.
𝗙𝗲𝗄𝗧𝗲𝗏𝗄𝗧. Hello, my name is Sutton King. I am the co-founder and president of the Urban Indigenous Collective, a nonprofit advocating on the behalf of urban natives in the tri-state area. I'm head of impact at Journey Colab, a drug development company led by Sam Altman and 𝗙𝗪𝗏 developing psychedelic treatments for mental health. And last but not least, I'm the co-founder of Shock Talk, a culturally tailored mental health platform that facilitates culturally appropriate patient-provider relationships. So I would really consider myself an Indigenous health advocate, researcher, and social entrepreneur that's really dedicated to developing and scaling innovative solutions to improve Indigenous health equity across sectors. Thank you all for having me. Really excited to be in dialogue with so many wonderful community members.
Thank you, Sutton. Andrew.
Hi, everybody. I'm Andrew DeAngelo. I've been an activist and social entrepreneur in the cannabis space my entire adult life. I was part of the group that legalized medical in California in 1996, and also the group that legalized medical in Washington, D.C. 2 years later. I'm currently president of the board of directors and co-founder of Last Prisoner Project. That's a nonprofit that is dedicated to getting all cannabis prisoners out of jail and reintegrated into society, and of course their records expunged. And I'm also known as a co-founder of 𝗏𝗶𝗶𝗶𝗏, which is now a vertically integrated, publicly traded cannabis company here in California.
Thank you, Andrew. Jason.
Hey everybody, my name is Jason Ortiz. I'm the executive director of Students for Sensible Drug Policy, which is a 501c3 nonprofit that is the largest youth-led drug policy organization in the world. We actually have chapters in 30 different countries and over 100 chapters here in the US. I'm also the immediate past president of the Minority Cannabis Business Association, which is a trade association for people of color in the cannabis industry to get more of our community in the industry as owners, employees, and consumers. And I'm somebody that got my start in the industry when I got arrested for cannabis possession in high school. But luckily enough, organizations like SSDP changed a law called the Higher Education Act's Federal Aid Elimination Penalty, which allowed folks with criminal histories to access federal financial aid. So I was able to go to college, actually find SSDP as a student, and now I'm the executive director. And I am primarily based here in Hartford, Connecticut, and also split my time in Puerto Rico. So thank you again so much for all the opportunities to talk about what we learned in the cannabis equity space and how we can translate that into the psychedelic space with SSDP's premier program that we have moving now called the Psychedelic Pipeline that we'll talk about a bit later.
Awesome. Thanks, Jason. And Serena.
Hi, it's great to join this panel. I am the co-founder of Plant Medicine Law Group. Originally, I was working at 𝗍𝘀𝗆𝗆 as a litigation and regulatory attorney, but after 4 years, I decided to leave and co-founded this law group, Plant Medicine Law Group, to focus on psychedelics and cannabis.
Thank you, Serena. So my intention for this panel is really to learn and to educate and to raise awareness on a range of topics. And I myself find myself to be learning every day and realizing the nuances and complexities here. So I'm kind of approaching this conversation with a beginner's mind. Wanted to kind of start off with recognizing the fact that these are big topics: reciprocity, equity, inclusion, really with nuances and their own many definitions, so to speak. And so wanted to start on the topic of reciprocity. And Sutton, I know that you've been working for a long period now and living reciprocity and experiencing it. And from our conversations, when we talk about defining it, you astutely say, well, we need to start with this concept of kinship. And so it would be great if you can kind of talk about what kinship means to you and how it relates to the psychedelic sector.
Sure. Thank you, Greg. And I think kinship for me, really from a cultural context, I'm Afro-Indigenous, and being Afro-Indigenous and coming from both the Menominee Oneida Nations of Wisconsin, kinship was something that was really centered throughout a lot of my childhood, my adulthood, really looking at being a good relative. That's what kinship means. It's really the shared Indigenous teaching that many of us share. Of course, we're not monolithic, but many of our cultures really center kinship that really relies us and requires, honestly, for us to be in relationship with all things to really achieve harmony and sustainability, more importantly. And I think within Indigenous worldviews, kinship is really the bedrock of what contemporary world has really coined to be diversity, equity, and inclusion. And I think that as these DEI practices move forward into the forefront of the 21st century, it's important to recognize that Indigenous communities have really understood the need to center contemporary kinship practices really as a mean to achieve just and a sustainable world for time immemorial, and really recognizing the grandfather teachings of my community to ensure biodiversity within our Menominee forests, which is one of the most dense forests in the Midwest, provides us with everything that we need as a community to survive off the land. And so really, I think that looking at kinship in the space in the psychedelic sector, I think it's really fundamental when we're thinking about how to be innovative and how to be equitable so that all of our communities can prosper.
That's beautiful. In terms of reconciling the concept of kinship and manifesting it, and then how do you translate that into operationalizing it in this, in this society, in this capitalistic society that we find ourselves currently in? How does it actually then manifest yeah?
Well, I think reciprocity, it's really important to understand that reciprocity is not transactional. Reciprocity is relational. So it's really important to be in community with one another and to have important dialogues around what that means for each community. Again, not being monolithic, requires unique perspectives. It requires difficult conversations, having true seats at the table, and really understanding that reciprocity for most people is not just cutting a check. It's not just a donation. It's really talking about the harms that have been done and how we can really create some restorative justice around that. So reciprocity and kinship for different communities will look different ways, and it's our responsibility to understand what that means.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and in terms of, I guess, a brief history, at least in there's many histories to be told here, but if there is I would say one history that there are conventions sort of that have already been written are the UN declarations around the Nagoya Protocol and free, prior, and informed consent. I think it would be great if you could kind of talk through what those mean, if there are places that people can look to further educate themselves on it. Always helpful, but please share.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's really important, especially where we're at this time where, there's a lot of folks interested in reciprocity and equity and how they operationalize that. And what's so great is that there are so many different Indigenous leaders around the world who have created protocols and declarations to guide folks on how to interact with Indigenous communities and how to really create meaningful pathways to have dialogue and respect treaties. And so The Nagoya Protocol really is an international agreement that covers biodiversity and the application of benefits arising from use. It was adopted in 2010 in Nagoya, Japan, and was entered in 2014. Unfortunately, the US has not signed onto it, but many other countries have. But again, this is something that has really been, demonstrated as a pathway to protect plant medicine and indigenous people's rights and sovereignty and data sovereignty. Data sovereignty as well. And then as it relates to the free, prior, and informed consent, now this is really a way in which companies can ensure that they are receiving consent from different countries and organizations as well as nations before using any genetic material or anything that arises thereof of our cultural and traditional knowledge, and really sets a framework to protect and guide indigenous peoples as well as organizations how to sit down, ensure that there is access to benefit sharing, that there is really a safe container being provided to ensure that consultation is looked at as protocol and not just an afterthought when it comes to indigenous peoples who have oftentimes been alienated from businesses who have been informed by our own practices. And so I think it's really important that folks take a look at just some of these different conventions, whether it's the United Nations Convention in Biological Diversity, and really look at the resources that have been put forward for us to really leverage at this critical time in community.
Mm-hmm. Yep. Excuse me. And so I guess bringing it all back, one of the projects, businesses that you're very involved in is Journey Colab. And so I guess on the topic of reciprocity, and then we'll move into the diversity, equity, inclusion, sort of the intersection, so to speak, or at least that's how I think about it. Can you talk about the specific ways in which Journey Colab is engaging in reciprocity and what you've learned along the way? I'm always interested if there are obstacles that you have faced too, that are learnings that to share with others would be great.
Absolutely. I think not only are we working to build a drug development company that's modeled after a stakeholder model that can transform these medicines and technologies, but we're building a successful company that really will create immense value for shareholders. And that's all shareholders. We look at indigenous communities as shareholders also through the Journey Reciprocity Trust. And so that Reciprocity Trust holds equity on behalf of and really for the benefit of communities who and organizations who are really building an accessible and equitable mental health sector, as well as those who are working to protect the ecological origins of psychedelic medicines. So as we are taking synthetic mescaline through FDA, we are ensuring that there is value in the trust to protect the peyote, the San Pedro, where these medicines naturally occur. I think it's really important that we are really threading reciprocity and kinship within the DNA of Journey Colab as a startup, so that we can really show up in this way and really start the dialogue, which I think has been really beautiful to see us be able to contribute to. And so the trust was really developed by our founding team to serve as a mechanism to include, again, all shareholders. To really ensure that that the benefits that are arising from mescaline are being implemented and distributed in a way that are equitable. And that's inspired, again, by the Nagoya Protocol, that's inspired by the United Nations Convention on Biological Diversity, but takes it a step forward to ensure that there's a consultation process. And that process is really inspired by the free, prior, and informed consent. Although it is not free, prior, and informed consent, it really takes these principles and the steps that have been laid forward to create that pathway to really design and to ensure that there's fair and equitable sharing, again, of those benefits that arise from the trust, and really making sure that we're having just meaningful dialogue with various stakeholders, whether it's elders in the communities, indigenous communities, therapists, advocates. It's important that we're having a community perspective on how this money should be distributed. And again, really creating that safe container to create and build space and trust within community and educate stakeholders on the journey Colab approach to reciprocity and what equity means, and for stakeholders who are inclined to provide insight on what is appropriate in terms of therapeutic approaches within Journey Colab. So I think that while designing this, it's been very exciting and inspiring. Some of the lessons that I've learned, or I think some of the lessons that have been reinforced, rather, for me is that when working with Indigenous communities, we are truly on Indigenous timelines, and Indigenous, as an Indigenous person myself, these conversations that we are having are very delicate. Some can look at what's happening as perhaps a spiritual warfare. And so being very delicate about these conversations is very, very important in allowing the key stakeholders in Indigenous communities to really create their plans, to create their stances, and to unify and be able to raise their voices without impeding on that, I think is very, very important. And so just really being mindful and adjusting your own timelines in accordance to where Indigenous communities are, and being able to be flexible on that. Because again, Silicon Valley may run on lightning speed timelines, but Indigenous peoples, we really take our time. We put these seeds in the ground when the ground is ready, not just because of a calendar date. And I think that's really an important lesson for all folks to take home today.
Right. I would just jump in and say that transactions move much faster than kinship does.
That's right.
Yeah, there's definitely a reconciliation there. Very different timelines. So you had talked about you'd mentioned the term, the definition of equity, and Jason, you came to mind as somebody who has been drafting equity policy for a significant period of time, and so I think this would be so I think this would be a good time for you to kind of jump in to explain how you understand equity. And I feel like part of understanding equity in your context is also understanding the history of the war on drugs. Andrew, I know you also have some understanding in this of this history. Serena, as someone from the plant medicine law group working with both psychedelics and cannabis, you as well. So Jason, I kind of wanted to pass the mic to you to kind of talk through how you understand this, the concept of equity and how it relates to history, and I would say collaboratively paint the picture of what it actually means for the audience.
And that's the question of the decade, huh? What does equity mean? I've had to deal with defining that with many different groups in different contexts, and the reality is that it's a different meaning to all of those different contexts. But for me, the short version, especially when it was starting out specifically about cannabis equity, was ensuring that the benefits of the legal cannabis industry are primarily given to those who suffered the primary burden of the war on drugs. So people of color, indigenous folks, queer folks, we were all targeted for enforcement and arrest and prosecution by the legal system for our interaction with a plant that the state didn't like, right? That's really what it came down to. But back in the early 1900s with Henry Anslinger, he was very explicitly racist about why he was pushing the criminalization of cannabis, and he used the Spanish term marijuana, and it was very clearly to prosecute immigrants and African-American folks that he didn't like, and they were using it for political reasons. And it wasn't just a war on cannabis, it was a war on many drugs. For folks that maybe saw the Billie Holiday documentary, you can see that Anslinger played a real big role in oppressing her and making sure she couldn't even sing for his own political reasons. And so fast forward 40 years or so, maybe 50 years to Nixon in the early 70s, when he declared the official war on drugs and coined that term, even though his advisors have admitted since then that the purpose was definitely political, to lock up the African Americans and the hippies that were protesting the war against Vietnam. So it's been a politically and racially motivated war from day one, and it still continues to this day. And as a person that was arrested, you become an activist the moment somebody puts chains on you for interacting with a plant that they don't approve of, right? And so when I got arrested, I got thrown out of school. Luckily, I was able to do a lot of my own research, and there was 3 terms that really changed my life. One was the war on drugs, which is actually a war on people that use drugs. The school to prison pipeline, which is the specific portion of the war on drugs that meant to criminalize youth, and in lots of ways, not just for drug possession, and selective enforcement. And the selective enforcement was the one that radically changed how I saw the legal system, because it meant that some laws are enforced on certain communities and not others. So when we're talking about equity, the important thing is to remember that because of the war on drugs, we are not starting at a level playing field. Some groups have been pushed and held back. Other ones have given a head start. So in order to make it a more equitable space now, so that those who are most impacted by the war on drugs can benefit from the legal industries of various drugs now, we have to actually provide supports and on-ramps to give those folks a chance to be able to compete with the folks that had a head start for 40 years. So for us, it meant very specifically in the law mandating 3 different types of equity. And this was, again, specifically in reference to the cannabis industry, but can definitely be transferred over into the psychedelic industry as we move into that space. But it was criminal justice reform, community investment, and ownership. And that meant in the law, we wanted to look at any legalization of cannabis bill and see if they included letting people out of prison who are using the plant, and not just for simple possession, for sales and cultivation as well, because that's what we're legalizing is sales and cultivation. That we're providing reentry support services for those folks and investing directly into the communities that were selectively targeted, right? So when I said before selective enforcement, that selective enforcement happened on a community scale. So when we're thinking about how to spend the revenue, the tax revenue that is going to come in from the industry, that should go back into those communities that were redlined, that were targeted, that were over-policed and had families disrupted and destroyed. And then the last piece is ownership, and making sure that the folks that were incarcerated, put in a cage and put chains and shackles on them for selling cannabis, are able to own a legal cannabis industry in the new market. And we are seeing the industry making that pretty difficult. And so for us, those are the 3 big chunks of equity programs that we want to see in the law. In addition to that, all the private businesses also have a particular moral obligation to give back, because they only exist because of the work that came before us from the folks that were incarcerated, the folks that fought to change laws. And so the entire industry, both cannabis and psychedelics, wouldn't be here today if it wasn't for the activists. And so I think the private space does have a moral obligation to give back, to create programs for folks to be able to join the industry, and to support programs like SSDP's Psychedelic Pipeline. And so because we saw the school to prison pipeline, we wanted to make sure that we were creating the exact opposite of that as we move forward, to be able to tell youth and young people that are interested in neuroscience and pharmacy and chemistry that if you join SSDP and work with us to help end the war on drugs, we'll be able to connect you with mentors that are working in the psychedelic space to be able to provide academic opportunities, employment opportunities, or maybe even business opportunities. And so we wanted to be very deliberate that we're creating pipelines to prosperity for young people, not just kind of undoing the damage that was done before, which is important. And we have to put reparations in lots of different ways. Otherwise, the unlicensed markets will continue to exist. And I think that's fine. Honestly, if the same way we have for many, many years. I would like to see, however, that new industries that join the psychedelic space, the drug space, take a conscious review of their work and their place in the work that's happened, and make very deliberate, explicit efforts from day one to reinvest in positive programs like the Psychedelic Pipeline or other community investment. But for me, it's been really fascinating, because even within the people of color, the definition of equity is very different. And the big question is, what is sufficient justice for what the war on drugs did? Is it $1 billion? Is it $1 billion? Is it $1 trillion? Right? We have to actually quantify the damage done to our communities before we can really decide what's sufficient justice, right? And who gets to decide what's sufficient justice? a legislature, right, full of folks that are relatively rich white men, or the communities that were most impacted. And this is the fight that's happening in every state house across the country and many other countries around whether or not these equity programs that are being created are sufficient, or are they designed to fail so that folks can later on say, oh, we tried to give back to these communities, but it didn't work. Here in Connecticut, we recently legalized cannabis. It was a big fight over equity and the definition of equity. And I was in a big battle with the governor around whether or not we would include criminal histories as a qualifier to access ownership support and business support. So whether or not the purpose of equity programs, in my opinion, which would be to give back to those people specifically, whether or not they should be included. So it's clear that in a narrative sense, people of color have forced the equity conversation into the broader debate. However, institutions are still willfully and painfully resistant to actually understanding what we're talking about. They're happy to put equity in name only in different types of programs, but still miss the mark on actually helping our communities and including the communities. So with MCBA, the Minority Cannabis Business Association, we did convene policy summits that were for people of color, 100% people of color, that draft and model policies both in the state level and the municipal level, and it's minoritycannabis.org, that was coming from us and by us and funded 100% by people of color, so that we could be bringing our ideas to the table, our definition of equity, rather than just fighting other people's bad bills. And so we saw that play out in Connecticut. It was quite a wild fight. Eventually, we did get some pretty fantastic programs passed, although I definitely think there's a lot more work to do there. But now we have the victims and the survivors of the war on drugs are fighting every single day to make sure all of our communities become whole. And to me, that fight is really the essence of what the equity movement is trying to do.
I love your energy and enthusiasm, and I feel it. You know, I was reading about Connecticut and the recreational licenses that are now can be issued for cannabis, and I was reading how I believe 50% of those licenses will go to social equity applicants. Is that right? And I'm curious. Well, A, is that right? And B, if that's right, I'm curious, like, what the psychedelic equivalent of that could look like.
So it's right on paper. However, the timeline as far as who gets to get started makes a big difference here. So we currently have 4 cultivators, and they're cultivator and manufacturers, and they own the entire industry in Connecticut. So the current medical industry gets to flip over first immediately. Now, the tax we put on that first to market conversion was $3 million per cultivator. So it's not a small fee for them to get that head start, although they'll obviously make significantly more than that in the head start. But the problem I have with the head start is that it creates a perverse incentive for them to use the profits to delay everything else. Right? If you allow the medical industry to go first, they're going to make lots of money. In that meantime, why not spend it on lobbying to sue the state, delay the programs, have people on the board, just slow things down? You know, it makes financial sense for them to do that. So where the 50% part was a victory, right? I was fighting over this timeline from day one. And eventually, long term, I think it will be significant. And to be clear, it's 50% of the licenses given out in the lottery in the first wave. Right. So it doesn't dictate what happens 10 years from now. Mm-hmm. This is really just the beginning. And the question of, well, how many licenses are we talking about? Right. So it could be 50% of 2. Right. And if that's the case, then we're not really winning out much of anything in this process. If it's 50% of 1,000, okay, we can do that. But that wasn't set by the state. That'll be set by the new the Social Equity Commission in cooperation with the Department of Consumer Protection. But we don't know exactly how many it's going to be. The other thing that makes this a bit, odd is the definition of who gets to qualify as a social equity applicant. And because they didn't include folks with a criminal history, and they only used a geographic qualifier, this is where it gets a bit confusing, that it's particular census tracts that had a higher than 10% unemployment rate over the last 5 years, or a higher than 10% arrest rate for cannabis over the same time. Anyone that lives in one of those census tracts that also made less than $250,000 a year and lived in Connecticut for 5 of their last 10 years and also live in a census tract, they qualify as a social equity applicant. So generally speaking, that's a pretty big part of most major cities. However, if you're somebody that was incarcerated for 10 years and moved out of the hood because you didn't want to get in trouble anymore, you might not qualify, where somebody that is in New Haven and is going to Yale, for example, and lives near Yale would qualify. So this is where the details of the qualifications matter a lot. And the other piece, again, we don't know the exact census tracts that that's going to include. So we passed the bill without really knowing who it's going to include. And so we forced the issue of including those with criminal history. So be very clear, if you got arrested, you're one of these people. And the governor literally threatened to veto the entire bill, and the House stripped it out. Like, we got it in the Senate. It was in there. And then literally within 12 hours, they said, we're going to have no cannabis at all unless we rip this out. And the House took it out before they passed it. So there's a clear commitment here to getting parts of this wrong. On the positive side, I'll say one of the first things Connecticut did was they're actually going to bond $50 million to put into the social equity fund to address not having money at the beginning of the process. Because generally speaking, it comes through revenue that will go into the social equity fund. But the state, I believe, and then to be fair, it's the state that arrested everybody. It's the state that incarcerated everyone. It's not the businesses and it's not the consumers. But we want to make sure everybody is pitching in for these programs to continue. But Connecticut was definitely a big, mashup of like demands from the equity side and demands from big business. And they just mushed it all together and tried to pass it within 24 hours of releasing it. That was the other thing. They released the final bill Saturday night at 11 p.m. for a vote on Monday morning. And trying to explain where to change a 300-page bill, right, in like 36 hours is why we ended up in a special session. But it's also how we end up with both amazing programs and terrible programs side by side.
Yeah, you're talking to the multi-dimensionality of this challenge. This is governmental, this is business, this is activist from the grassroots side of things, and it's complicated. Basically, net, you can't read a headline and think you understand it. You need to speak to Jason.
There's a battle, like Jason alluded to. There is a real battle going on right now for the soul of the cannabis industry, and it has so many cautionary tales for the psychedelic, I guess, industry that is now emerging. I hope we keep calling it the psychedelic community, not the psychedelic industry. The word industry has not been good for cannabis. It used to be 5 years ago, if you asked most people what the brand of the cannabis industry is, a lot of folks would say, most folks I think would say, oh, those are folks that are about wellness and helping people and bringing this medicine out of the shadows and into the light and helping kids with epilepsy and Sanjay Gupta's show and all this medical and therapeutic branding. Well, if you ask people now, many of those same people are going to say it's all about the money. And this is a huge cautionary tale. I'm very proud of activists like Jason and so many others that have forced this conversation into the halls of legislatures and congresses all throughout the country and the world. We have a lot of work to do. If you look at every framework, every single legal framework has gotten this wrong, and we've been forced. California is the perfect example of this. We were in a room with basically a 12-headed hydra of different stakeholders before we put adult use on the ballot, because in California we had medical for a long time, then we tried to do adult use in 2010, we lost. The federal government came in and busted a bunch of legacy and black and brown people after we lost that election. So we couldn't lose again. We absolutely could not lose again, or that would have happened again. And so we had to make a lot of compromises with law enforcement, with local control, with all of these stakeholders. And there weren't a whole lot of people of color in that room fighting that fight. There were legacy people like me and my brother articulating the need for this. But in order to pass that law, just like Connecticut, you want a law or don't you? Well, guess what? You're going to have to compromise. And we're going to do all this stuff at the last minute. And we're going to get the public policy wrong. And good luck fixing it, because it's really hard to fix once the law has been passed. Because what's going to happen in Connecticut is what's happened in California, where the legislature just doesn't want to touch it anymore. We passed the law, it's done. I don't want to mess with cannabis. It's a losing issue for me. No matter what I do, it's a losing issue for me. I'm not going to touch it anymore. We're not going to fix it. Basically, F you. So this is the challenge that we're facing in the cannabis community with, you know, the soul of the very industry and community is at stake here. So I hope the psychedelic community can learn from this, because I'm just now starting to dip my toe from the cannabis industry into psychedelics, and I hope that what I can provide is sort of these cautionary tales and lessons. I lost my company and I lost my job at Harborside because of this problem of reconciliation. So, and it's painful. I've had to manage a pivot. Now I've managed my pivot pretty good, and I'm excited about Last Prisoner Project and the other things I'm working on now. But there's a lot of legacy people and Black and brown people who are being left behind, and they're going into the underground market, rightfully so in many cases. And now we have the problem of two markets, and it's a real problem, because there's going to be Prohibition 2.0 launched against the underground market by the legal industries if we don't put up a big fight for that. So that's what I worry about. And we're already seeing initiatives in California to fund that enforcement. And, you know, the enforcers don't distinguish between big cartel grows on public lands in California that probably need to be enforced against, and some Black and brown people or legacy people like me up in the Emerald Triangle or in the cities of Los Angeles or Oakland or San Francisco. And they're going to get enforced against the same communities that we locked up the first time. And this is a moral problem and imperative for our industry to get right. We're not getting it right. We're not getting it anywhere close to right. And folks like Jason and myself are fighting the good fight, and we'll see. It's very difficult because powerful forces, one, are aligned against us, and they did it in Connecticut, and two, or they're just misunderstood. You know, like this home grow thing.
They know what they're doing.
Yeah, okay. But actually, if I was a big corporation, and I would actually advocate for home grow, because it actually increases my business. It's not a threat to me whatsoever. So I think that there's some misunderstanding as well as some really bad intentions, Jason. Yeah, you're absolutely right.
So let's come up with some solutions. And Serena, I know you've done a lot of thinking on the hybrid business models that could facilitate equitable access. So it'd be great if you could kind of share your thinking on this subject and kind of point to some of the organizations that you have, in your research, in your work that you want to kind of highlight in terms of a way forward.
Yeah, and just on a note about cannabis and social equity programs, the fight is happening in New York right now, and it's really exciting because we haven't seen the regulations yet. And there are forces, for good or for evil, whatever you want to think about it, they're advocating for different interests and kind of taking what Andrew and Jason are talking about, learning from the other states and taking these cautionary tales and figuring out a way forward to do things differently. So for example, one of the things that it's great if you have a program, but it's not great if people who fit and qualify as social equity applicants, they don't have the resources to get up and running, and they're still left behind. So one of the things that would be helpful in the New York market is to create the resources, the support to help these type of applicants establish the type of companies, get it running, and then kind of like really invest in them so that they can grow and thrive. So that's one way forward in the cannabis market in New York, just because the regulations have not been promulgated. And in a lot of these, in the psychedelic space as well as the cannabis space, a lot of it really, a lot of the legal structure can inform how you run the business, how you run the company. So traditionally, we have like LLCs, we have C Corps, and these are legal structures that are set up to create a legal, what we consider to be like a legal person, and they're running this business. And this legal person has a certain governing structure. And traditionally, the main stakeholder is the shareholder. It's like whoever is profiting, who are the owners, the officers and the directors have to run the company in their best interest. However, there are these other structures, these other things that people can do. One form is called a benefit corporation or a public benefit corporation in Delaware. So it really depends on the state law. It just will have different names. And what it does is that it's a legal entity structure that allows the company or the business to focus on a specific purpose, whether it's for social, economic, or environmental benefit. Like you are basically putting into the governing documents that, yes, we're there to create a business for profit, and we have a social purpose that we want to invest in, we want to focus on. And what it does is that these the governing bylaws will require the directors and officers to take action that would work to satisfy that purpose, whatever that might be. And they have to be transparent. They have to like show reports to the shareholders who are the owners, and say like, hey, we're considering these variety of different stakeholders. It's not just the shareholders, and we're advocating for this social benefit or this public benefit. And here's how we have done. Basically, creating a progress report to let the public as well as the shareholders know about how they're doing. And at the same time, because traditionally directors and officers, they have a duty to the shareholders to act in their best interest. And if they don't act in their best interest, they could be liable for a breach of fiduciary duties. But when you have a legal structure that says, no, you have to think about other stakeholders and you can think about other public benefits and other purposes, then the officers and the directors are really incentivized and protected to go beyond just making profit and focusing on generating profit for the business. The other thing that people do are what they call B corporations or B Corps, but this is not a legal structure. It's more of a certification that's provided by a third party called B Labs, which is a nonprofit. And the certification, you just have to meet certain standards of social and environmental performance, accountability, and transparency. And they have their assessment tools to do this. But one of the things that's really interesting about the B Corp certification is that there's also some kind of legal requirement that they basically require that you might have to change your legal structure to in order for you to consider how your companies and your business activities would have an impact on all stakeholders. So this could be converting to a public benefit corporation if you're in Delaware, a benefit corporation if you're in California, or it might just be changing your LLC, operating agreement, your partnership agreements, whatever it is that's the governing document for how you're going to run your business. And so these are like two forms right now that people are working with. And however, there's a lot of other creative strategies that focus on the ownership piece, kind of like similar to what Journey Colab is doing. You can have, rather than have like individuals or certain companies be owners and invest in your company, you can have the ownership given to a nonprofit. It could be given to a perpetual purpose trust. Whatever that trust is just basically you're creating a vehicle that kind of removes the individual individual shareholders as the eventual ownership profiteers of the company, and you're putting into nonprofits, these trusts, they have other purposes, they have other reasons for existence. So it kind of allows a little bit more freedom for directors and officers to act and figure out what they can do that would actually benefit the shareholders, that isn't a person that just cares about making money. And there's a lot of examples of this, like Journey Colab is a great example. MAPS has a really interesting structure because they're owned by the nonprofit, but they're also a public benefit corporation too. There's a lot of we've talked to a lot of people trying to figure out how to, like, they have these social benefits or these public benefits that they want to cultivate and make it their goal. But again, it's like, can they do this as a public benefit corporation, or do they start out as a traditional entity, whether it's an LLC or a C Corp or whatnot, and then they convert later on? Because sometimes it might make sense to start off as one of these hybrid structures, but it might also make sense later on to convert, depending on the financial circumstances, the goals where each company is at the very early stages. And there's reciprocity doesn't have to come just from like how you organize the company and the activities, but it comes from like, what are you trying to do? What is the business trying to do? So for example, I know there are retreat centers that are offering scholarships to individuals who can't afford the sessions or the retreat, 1 week's worth of retreat, or they're offering, they're servicing like the local individuals. Basically in Jamaica, there are retreat centers there. They're offering locals these sessions, these retreat sessions, for very low or no cost at all, because they want to give back to that community. Or there's this one biotech company in Canada. They're working with, it's also in Jamaica, but they're working with the government's scientific research entity in Jamaica, so that they can actually, learn a lot about mushrooms. They can do a lot of research with respect to mushrooms, share the IP, and at the same time, use all of what they've learned to grow and help with economic and social development in Jamaica. So reciprocity first can come from the legal entity structure in terms of how the founders are thinking about how the business should be run, who are the owners. But there are other activities too that, given the partnership in terms of what they want to give back in terms of percentages of their earnings, there are other ways to demonstrate reciprocity in addition to figuring out the equity structure, the legal structure.
Serena, a quick question, because Harborside, me and my brother tried to be a B Corp here in California when we brought investors in and we started taking money, and we knew that that was a slippery slope for us. Mm-hmm. And so we tried to be a B corporation, but the B Lab wouldn't allow us to be a B corporation because of the Schedule I status. So that was a few years ago. Has anything evolved there? Or maybe we needed someone like you to help us be a little bit more creative with the entity structure so that we could basically put checks and balances in to these new stakeholders, investors coming in. We knew that their interests were not going to be aligned with ours, so we wanted to put some circuit breakers in there. We failed to do that. What's going on with B Lab in respect to B Corps, or what advice do you have for founders that want to put those circuit breakers in so that we can protect the community that we founded the organization for in the first place?
Yeah, I'm not aware of what's happening with B Lab with respect to Schedule I substances. I think that's a really interesting question, and I can figure that out and get back to you separately. But it's but at least in the psychedelic space, because a lot of these substances are not legal even on the state level, except for Oregon, a lot of these companies are part of the ecosystem that's going to support, hopefully, the eventual legalization or decriminalization of the use and possession of these Schedule I substances. And I think right now the problem is that unless you have a public benefit corporation, there is no requirement for you to think about all the other stakeholders. You can have a C Corp and build into the governing structure that you need to think about all these X, Y, and other stakeholders. But again, the legal precedents actually indicate that, the directors and officers, first and foremost, they have to think about the shareholders. And because of that incentive, it's just, even if you put in the governing documents of a C Corp, it can be taken out by investors later on, it can be changed, et cetera, et cetera. So really the main way I'm seeing is you can have a public benefit corporation without getting the B Corp certification. because, and it has the same sachet, I think, because, I mean, you have a certification that's by a third party, but with a public benefit corporation, you have to be transparent and you have to produce a report saying like, this is what our goals were with respect to public benefit. Here's what we have done. Here's where we have succeeded. Here's where we have failed. Here's where we need to go. So it can signal to the broader general public, like, this is what we are trying to do. Look at our reports. And you can build transparency. You can build enough support without having a certification. But again, it goes back a lot to the governance of the business. And the governance, unless there's some legal requirement for somebody to do something, they might not do it.
All right, Serena, thank you for that legal consultation. Appreciate it. Everybody, this was really enlightening. I appreciate all of your perspectives. We are out of time. If you want to drop any links to the projects or initiatives that you're working on, Jason, I know that you're doing the SSDP. That's pretty rad. Feel free to drop it in here. And I think we're going to wrap up momentarily. So thank you, everybody, for participating. And I look forward to continuing this much needed conversation and acting on it. So thank you.